Our topic for today is all about historical research. What is historical research? Historical research studies the past event in an attempt to interpret the facts and explain the cause of the events and the relevance and effect in the present situation. Historical research is used to compare the records of the historical events and the activities surrounding to them. Historical research also helps to organize historical events sequentially and to preserve the historical data. The basic purposes of historical research are to provide a clear perspective of the present and to facilitate planning for the future by identifying general principles applicable to recurring situations. Chronology can be defined as simply the describing of events in the order of their occurrence, a process similar to the older concept of historical research. Why chronology is important? Chronology is important because it represents the first step in the process of historical research and provides material or data for the step to follow. History has two dimensions, both of which are important to the interpretation of historical data. One dimension is historical time or the chronology, which takes into account the spacing of events and patterns. A good example of such chronology, which is sometimes referred to as a timeline, is Library in the U.S. Timeline, compiled by Wigan for the American Library Association in 1999. The second dimension is historical space, or where event occurred. Example, geographical location. As Boscia and Harter indicate, historical research can contribute to the body of knowledge about librarianship. It can increase our understanding of how, when, and why past events occurred, and it can expand our appreciation of the significance of these events. Endowing historical research. All historical inquiry begin with a question that asks why or how things happened in the past, or historian asks so what, reflective questions that seek meaning. Who, what, where, when questions are important to establish context but do not offer deep or interesting historical conclusion. The bottom line is all history begins with asking a question. And the trick to getting good to doing good historical work is to ask good analytical questions from the start. In short, a knowledge and understanding of good historical research can help librarians build on the past an efficient, effective manner to avoid reinventing the wheel and to develop new theories and systems to advance the profession. Helway identifies 6 different types of historical research or documentary study. First, biographical research. Second, histories of institution and organization. Third, the investigation of sources and influences. Fourth, editing and translating historical documents. Fifth, studying the history of ideas. And lastly, compiling bibliographies. The extent to which these different types are employed depends on the nature of the inquiry and the subject field, whether they represent true historical research or the mere compilation of facts depends on the manner in which they are conducted. Historians use 2 types of sources to learn about the past, the primary and secondary. Primary sources were created at the time of our historical inquiry. They are considered to include the testimony of eyewitnesses or observation made with one of the other senses or by some mechanical device. Library-related primary sources may include official records, government documents, manuscripts, newspaper articles, letters, and statistics. But whether these sources are truly primary depends on whether they represent first-hand accounts. Secondary sources are written by historians about our research topic like textbook, journal articles, histories, and encyclopedias. The use of primary sources tends to ensure the integrity of a study and to strengthen its reliability. Their use provides the only solid base for conclusion reached in documentary research. In fact, Secondary sources may provide important insights and conceptual development not available elsewhere. By synthesizing the existing research literature, secondary sources help to round out the setting or fill in the gaps between primary sources of information and can suggest topics for future research. An external criticism, it is called lower order criticism. Internal criticism is called higher order criticism. External criticism checks the genuineness and authenticity of the data sources. Genuineness is who is written and when the document is written or by which it is written. By authenticity, we can get the knowledge about the signature, handwriting, carbonating, vocabulary usages of the document and that it was external criticism. External criticism often cannot prove the authenticity of a source, but it can provide reasonable confidence that a particular source is authentic. To assess the authenticity of a work, the investigator may use bibliographical techniques, genealogy, paleography, and heraldry. But external criticism is not only we can note the data has been evaluated, there is also the internal criticism. External criticism is generally more challenging than external criticism, and it too is often difficult, if not impossible, to achieve absolute certainty. Internal criticism is concerned with the validity and credibility of the data sources. Validity checks the proper relevance of the document. Credibility checks the proper meaning of the document. Different historians may espouse somewhat different procedures of historical research. In other words, historical research tends to involve the following steps. First, identification of a problem of historical significance. Second, collection of background information, example, literature review of the secondary sources. Third, formulation of a hypothesis when possible. Fourth, gathering of evidence of data, including verification of the authenticity of the primary sources and the validity, reliability of their contents. Fifth, organization and analysis of the pertinent data. It is more often qualitative than quantitative. And lastly, interpretation of the findings or the drawing of conclusion. In short, true historical research tends to resemble a scientific methods of inquiry or a problem-oriented approach. The hypothesis is a natural and useful device in historical methods. More specifically, the use of hypotheses in historical research help to increase the objectivity of the study and minimize researcher bias. It also guides the researcher in the collection, analysis, and interpretation of data by indicating what is relevant to the study. The hypothesis provides a basis for considering various factors in relation to one another, for synthesizing them into a generalization or conclusion that puts their overall significance in focus. Causal hypotheses are particularly complex and difficult to establish in historical research, but in spite of being inherently difficult to deal with, causality is often thought to be important to consider in historical study. In short, the consideration of causality forces the researcher to move beyond mere description and to reflect on why certain relationships seem to exist. On the other hand, not all historians are in agreement that consideration of causality is essential to good historical research. The data collection technique for historical research basically involves putting together in a logical fashion the evidence derived from documents or records. This process also often involves the comparing and reconciling of information gathered from two or more sources. Before beginning a historical study, the researcher should have a specific plan for the acquisition, organization, storage, and retrieval of the data. Tertiary sources, such as library catalogs and periodical indexes, are routinely used to identify and access resources. The use of note cards, bibliography cards, multiple files, and so on can be quite helpful when gathering data from the resources. Storing notes in database files provide automatic search capabilities and enables the researcher to code the data for content analysis. Electronic files can also facilitate the use of computer software and programs for data analysis and for translating, collecting, and comparing documents. The dual aspect of the historical enterprise, the effort to establish what happened and the attempt to explain why things happened in the way they did, explain the twofold task in historical writing. First, to convey a sense of the time or to show chronological development. Second, to analyze and explain the interrelationship of the events studied, to detect underlying patterns, to unify the various elements in a satisfactory whole which provide a response to the initial research problem using an analytical style or an approach by topic. Historical research conducted in library and information science has often been referred to as library history. Sheflet defines library history as a rubric that covers a myriad of topics associated with libraries and other information systems. Its major form consists of the traditional library, but it also includes the history of any activity or event that might be part of the domain of library and information science. Bush and Harter note that library history is commonly applied to an account of events that have affected any library or group of libraries as well as to the social and economic impacts of libraries on their communities. Bibliographical research that takes the form of descriptive bibliography certainly comes closer to being true research than the systematic or enumerative bibliography. The both types of bibliographical work are important scholarly endeavors which at very least support the work of true researchers or historians. Systematic or enumerative bibliography may be defined as the preparation of lists of books, in short, the compilation of bibliographies which list, describe, and arrange all graphic materials according to their affinity with each for reference or study. The results are one of the following compilation or list. First, universal bibliography, a bibliography that includes everything published or issued in a subject field regardless of date of publication. Second, national bibliography, a bibliography that lists everything published in a given country. Third, trade bibliography, a bibliography compiled primarily to aid the book trade by supplying information as to what books are in print or for sale. Fourth, subject bibliography, a bibliography that lists materials relating to a specific topic. Descriptive bibliography is concerned with the book as a physical entity or material object. An important function of descriptive bibliography is to describe the ideal copy or primary document and its variants. This process can be broken down into more specific bibliographical research, including the following. First, analytical bibliography, which is concerned with the physical description of the book in order to determine the details of the physical process. Second, textual bibliography, which focuses on certain textual variation between a manuscript and the printed books or among various editions. It is more concerned with the author's words than with the physical aspect of the book. Third, historical bibliography, which deals with identification of original edition and placing and dating of individual books. A variety of problems are common to the most of research but tend to be particularly important in historical research. First, deciding how much data are enough. Second, improperly selecting data. Third, relying too heavily on secondary sources of information. Fourth, investigating overly broad problem. Fifth, failing to evaluate adequately the historical data and their sources. 6. Failing to interpret the data. And lastly, reading the present into the past even though the historical data may not support such as interpretation. In order to explain the process of historical research, I've created something that I called it the history of pyramid. The history pyramid shows the relationship between your question thesis and the historical context, primary evidence, and secondary evidence. Basically, since all historical inquiry begins with a question, with your very strong analytical question about how or why something happened in the past, then you will get the historical context to see what exactly happened. And you have a good sense of what happened, you need to go instead of looking at primary sources material to get a very clear sense of how people in the past were either contributing or reflecting on what's going around them. And you have a good sense of what is going on in the past, then you consult specialized secondary sources written by historians to see what they think happened in the past. In the end, your job as spreading historians is to synthesize the historical context, primary evidence, and secondary sources together to come up an answer or your thesis to your question. That will be all. Thank you.